Walking into this building for the first time is an overwhelming experience. The richness of the materials it's made from, the wealth of art that it holds, and the sheer amount of work that has gone into it combine to quickly shift you out of the everyday and into the sanctity of its space. An inspiring setting for a reflection on the idea that the world will be saved by beauty. In his book, The Elements of Drawing, written through the winter of 1856 and first published in 1857, John Ruskin said that the noisy life of modern days is wholly incompatible with any true perception of natural beauty. Inordinate excitement and the pomp of daily life, he felt, would skew your senses and make you enjoy coarse colours and affected forms. Despite The Elements of Drawing being a book about how to draw, Ruskin believed that this truth of perception, or seeing truly, was a more important thing than drawing, saying he would rather teach drawing that my pupils may learn to love nature than teach the looking at nature that they may learn to draw. Lots of people I've spoken to over the last few months have talked about their own reconnection with nature as the country fell silent in late March. People started to hear the birds, to notice trees coming into leaf, to truly see the natural world again. Ruskin cared deeply about beauty and how it's expressed in the things that we make. He saw the relationship between the creating of beauty and the conditions of its creation as inextricably linked, believing that things produced by healthy and ennobling labour are recognised by the observance of three broad and simple rules. The first being, never encourage the manufacture of any article not absolutely necessary, in the production of which invention has no share. He continues that the cutting of precious stones requires little exertion of any mental faculty, some tact and judgment in avoiding flaws, but nothing to bring out the whole mind. Every person who wears cut jewels merely for the sake of their value is therefore a slave driver. John Dando Stedding, the architect who started building this church in 1888, was 19 years old when Ruskin's book, The Elements of Drawing, was published. The following year, aged 20, Stedding went to work in the offices of George Edmund Street, one of the most prolific Gothic revival architects, where the designer and writer William Morris and the architect Philip Webb also started out. Ruskin advised John Stedding that to be a real architect, you must always have either pencil or chisel in your hand. Stedding's aim in his work was to revive the medieval system of cooperation between architect and craftsman, very different to the division of labour that was developing around them. As Ruskin says in his piece, The Nature of Gothic, it is not, truly speaking, the labour that is divided, but the men, divided into mere segments of men, broken into small fragments and crumbs of life, so that all the little piece of intelligence that is left in a man is not enough to make a pin or a nail, but exhausts itself in making the point of a pin or the head of a nail. Even Adam Smith, who appears on our £20 note, along with his pin factory and the quote, the division of labour and the great increase in the quantity of work that results, was worried about the effects of the division of labour, saying that while it increased output, it also had consequences for the worker, who becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become, rendering them incapable of rational conversation or of conceiving any generous, noble, or tender sentiment, and consequently of forming any just judgment. Ruskin and Marx, Morris and Stedding and Smith see the effects of the division of labour clearly, partly because they're at the beginning of it. It's just starting. We're at the other end. and perhaps failing to see clearly how this pattern of division introduced through the Industrial Revolution is now in us not only as workers, but as artists and citizens, or customers and consumers and clients, as we're more often known. Ruskin's second rule for the production of things by healthy and ennobling labour is never demand an exact finish for its own sake, but only for some practical or noble end. Imperfection is a theme that Ruskin developed in The Nature of Gothic, saying, "No architecture can be truly noble which is not imperfect. For since the architect, whom we'll suppose capable of doing all in perfection, cannot execute the whole with his own hands, he must either make slaves of his workmen and level his work to a slave's capacity, which is so to degrade it, or else he must take his workmen as he finds them, and let them show their weaknesses together with their strength, which will involve the Gothic imperfection, but render the whole work as noble as the intellect of the age can make it." The east window behind me here, designed by Morris & Co., is the largest window they ever made. The 48 figures show apostles, patriarchs, kings, prophets and saints, angels, works of charity, the fall, the crucifixion, the Annunciation and the Nativity. All of the elements were designed by Burne-Jones except for one, and they all appear in other buildings as well as here. Enoch, who's on the second row of figures down, second from the left, in blue, was originally designed for the west window of Calcutta Cathedral in 1874. The only one not designed by Burne-Jones is St. Bartholomew, who's the figure in red on the top tier, 8th from the left, who was designed by William Morris. It's hard to see from where I'm standing, but he has a beard and curly hair. One story says that he was skinned alive and beheaded. So he's holding a curved flensing knife in his right hand and what's possibly quite a big piece of his own skin in his left. In 1891, Sedding caught a chill in Somerset while overseeing some restoration work, and he died suddenly, leaving Holy Trinity unfinished. Henry Wilson, who'd progressed from being Sedding's pupil to his assistant, took over. But despite his efforts, it remained unfinished. The west window, which Morris and Edward Burne-Jones had hoped to complete, never was. In a letter to Edward Clayton in 1841, Ruskin wrote, "Time was, when I began drawing, that I used to think a picturesque or beautiful tree was hardly to be met with once a month. I cared for nothing but oaks 1,000 years old, split by lightning or shattered by wind. Now there's not a twig in the closest clipped hedge that grows that I cannot admire and wonder at and take pleasure in and learn from. The imperfect and the unfinished are places of possibility, places still on a journey, still somehow alive in that process of change common to all of us and to everything." In The Nature of Gothic, Ruskin says, "Great art, whether expressing itself in words, colours or stones, does not say the same thing over and over again. The merit of architectural, as of every other art, consists in its saying new and different things." The idea of art not doing the same thing over and over sounds obvious, but in an age of mass production, it's easily overlooked. It's not simply about us not buying manufactured products marketed to us as art. Its manifestations are more subtle than that. In a society where success is measured most often in quantity and scale, as producers and funders and as audiences and even as artists, we can slip into artwork that's more likely to meet that measure. And we can do it without even realizing we're doing it, because that pattern is so entrenched in our lives. It can feel somehow right. That's not to say that everything that's large scale or financially successful is by its nature a piece of mass manufacture in a greater or lesser way, but we should always ensure that we're holding good to Ruskin's maxim of saying new and different things. Art is about change. I don't mean that art must always speak about change, although a lot of it does one way or another, or that all art must seek to create change, although some of it does. I mean that art has a relationship to change, in its making, in its transformation of materials, in the way that it acts on us as makers and as spectators. Ruskin's third rule for healthy and ennobling labour is never encourage imitation or copying of any kind except for the sake of preserving a record of great works. In the Elements of Drawing, he advises the student of art to resolve always, as you look at the thing, what you will take and what miss of it. Only remember this, that there is no general way of doing anything. So a stone may be round or angular, polished or rough, cracked all over like an ill-glazed teacup, or as united and broad as the breast of Hercules. It may be as flaky as a wafer, as powdery as a field puffball. It may be knotted like a ship's hawser, or kneaded like hammered iron, or knit like a Damascus sabre, or fused like a glass bottle, or crystallized like hoarfrost, or veined like a forest leaf. Look at it, and don't try to remember how anybody told you to do a stone. If you can draw the stone rightly, he felt, everything within reach of art is also within yours. And Ruskin wasn't alone in his feelings about the importance of nature. William Morris combined his love of history with his love of the natural world, saying, however original a man may be, he cannot afford to disregard the works of art that have been produced in times past. He's bound to study old examples, but he's also bound to supplement that by a careful study of nature. Writing about Morris's wallpaper willow boughs in her memoirs, his daughter May says that her and her father were walking one day by our little stream that runs into the Thames, and my father pointed out the detail, and soon after, the paper was done. John Sedding shared Ruskin and Morris's passion for the natural world, believing that nature is the source of all true art. The only book he published was Garden Craft Old and New, in which he wrote, "The garden is a sort of betweenity, part heaven, part earth, part nature, part man." The patterns that Ruskin and Morris and Sedding draw on are patterns we know deeply, not just from architecture and art, but from nature. We've been reading these patterns all of our lives. They're in us. They are us. As Ruskin says in the Elements of Drawing, nature is all made up of roundnesses. Boughs are rounded, leaves are rounded, stones are rounded, clouds are rounded, cheeks are rounded, and curls are rounded. There is no more flatness in the natural world than there is vacancy. The world itself is round, and so is all that is in it, more or less, except human work, which is often very flat indeed. And we know, even without knowing we know, that blood is transported around our bodies using the same branching patterns used by trees and leaves and rivers. We know that a fern head unfolds like water spiraling down a plug hole, just as the plates on the shell of a tortoise join like bubbles in a cluster, like mud at the bottom of a dried up pool, like the cracked glaze on a ceramic plate. And as water flows, so hair flows, falling and curling, and wood flows too, along patterns of stress. And while we may not have noticed these things, when we stop and think, when we stop and look, we know. These things feel right. They satisfy us. Again, in the Elements of Drawing, Ruskin says, the art or general productive and formative energy of any country is an exact exponent of its ethical life, of its social and political virtues. Sedding's pupil and assistant, Henry Wilson, said of him that it wasn't what he did, but what he made others do, calling him a radiant centre of artistic activity, a focus of creative fire, a node of magnetic force. Many people whose names we still know had a hand in this place, along with William Morris, Edward Burne-Jones and John Sedding, sculptors, Henry Hugh Armstead, Edward Onslow Ford and William Thornycroft, stained glass designers, William Blake Richmond and Christopher Wall, stained glass window maker James Powell. But whose hands worked with and for them? Morris & Co.'s catalogue of designs lists those who drew and painted the glass for the east window. Campfield, Cutting, Walters, Bowman, Stokes, Wren, Veal, and there are hundreds of others whose names we'll never know. Our connection to this building is also a connection to those who designed and made it and cared for it, to those whose ideas inspired it, and to the world, both the world we've created and the natural world. Sometimes it's easier to remember what has changed since then, but it's also important to remember what has stayed the same. The oak choir stalls were decorated by the sculptor Frederick Pomeroy, work that the art historian Peyton Skipwith calls one of the most important cycles of sculpture carried out in the late 19th century. Amidst the eagles and owls and elephants and lions and deer are angels, each holding a scroll that between them reads, "One sings to God, not with the voice but with vows, not with the music of a choir but with the heart, not by shouting but by loving." The thoughts and values of all those who have been here are carried in this place, in its physical form, reminding us of what motivated them and what might motivate us. And if the world is to be saved by beauty, then the experiences that we've had recently of seeing the natural world around us clearly are a very good place to start. And as the noise of the world and all it demands of us builds again, we must challenge ourselves to hold on to something of the ways of seeing that those experiences created, to maintain something of that connection with the natural world, to continue the lessons that it's begun to teach us. How do we do that? To give the last word to Ruskin, he instructs us, "Never force yourself to admire anything when you're not in the humour, but never force yourself away from what you feel to be lovely in search of anything better. And gradually, the deeper scenes of the natural world will unfold themselves to you in still increasing fullness of passionate power. Habits of patient comparison and accurate judgment will make your art precious, as they will make your actions wise."